need to continue to ask questions, not only of others, but of ourselves.
Welcome. Yay. So why don't we start with, tell us, I've got your bio, which we'll post, but for the membership, tell us in your own words who you are and why you're here.
Well, I am Dani Snyder Young. I'm an applied theater scholar, and I study the limits of theater in making social change.
The limits.
The limits. Much has been written on theater's capacity to change the world, and I study why that's hard. And that's because I, like a lot of artists and scholars who do TO, who do popular education, who are drawn to this kind of work, I came into it because I wanted to change the world and discovered how challenging those moments can be. So what I do as a scholar is I look at the relationship between theory and practice and examine the moments when theory's ideals knock up against the material conditions of production, and where the rubber meets the road, there's friction. And so I look at those moments of friction with the ultimate goal of trying to help practitioners do the work better. Wow.
There's so much in that, and it's actually for a recovering academic. It's like that is exactly, yeah. I'm glad we're starting with you. Can I ask you, I've read your bio, but also for those of us who have taken a non-traditional path to get to Boal, how did you find his work, Boal or Freire?
So initially I encountered Boal's work as an undergrad in a dramatic theory class, I think like a lot of people. And then it sort of floated away from my consciousness while I built a practice as a professional director in my 20s. I came back to graduate school to learn how to teach, in no small part because the freelance life of being a nomadic artist it didn't agree with me. And it was at NYU in graduate school that I dove deeper into the work of Boal and that I really encountered the work of Freire. So I studied Boal with Cristina Marin and with Chris Vine, and I ultimately went to Rio and studied Rainbow of Desire with Boal himself. And I did, my dissertation project was a TO project in an urban school. But I think many years later, it's Freire who's hung with me and who's made the most impact on my life that I didn't even realize until it was gone, that I'd been carrying around this chip on my shoulder, that I needed to be right, that I needed to prove that I was the boss, that I needed to be the expert. And I think that came from being in positions of responsibility from a very young age. I think that came from living in our capitalist society in which we sell our expertise. And by getting to really know Freire and internalizing that what I need to be able to do is ask questions and listen to the answers, real questions. And that I'm only an expert in my own experience, and my subject positioning is so far from neutral, and that on the global scale, being an upper middle class white woman in the United States is a strange experience. And it's mine, and is highly privileged and isn't everyone's. And that I therefore really need to ask real questions and listen to the answers and ask tough questions, because that's the way that we learn things. And in letting go of the need to be in charge, I mean, it's like amazing as a teacher, as an artist. It's transformative for my scholarship as a human being living in the world. And so I am eternally grateful and live and breathe Freire every day.
Wow. Okay, so the next question. I think you answered like how it changed your work. Was it about the questions?
It was. It was about the questions. My teaching and my research, they both revolve around asking real questions. My artistic work too, that ultimately these are forms of inquiry. And so as a scholar, I am asking questions I really don't know the answer to. If I can find the answer easily, that's awesome. It means I don't have to do the work to try to answer the question. Somebody already solves the problem. But most of the time, when I do find answers, they only lead to more questions. And so that it's a lifelong practice of digging deeper and deeper and deeper and peeling the levels of the onion and finding that the questions lead me on tangents to places I never would have thought. And as a critical pedagogue, that's what I'm doing in the classroom. I'm facilitating a process of inquiry. I'm teaching my students to ask real questions. I'm asking big, messy questions that, again, if there were easy answers, we wouldn't have to do the work.
Can you share with us, because it's, you know, as an artist, I can see that you're chewing on something right now. There's something you're like, what's the big, messy question you're working with right now?
Well, there are two big, messy questions I'm working with right now. So as I roll up my sleeves.
Yeah.
So 2 years ago, Matt Omasta and I did a study of published applied theater and educational theater research. We published it in RIDE. And like I said, it came out 2 years ago. And we examined more than 400 peer-reviewed journal articles that came out over the course of a 10-year span. And 90% of them were reporting exclusively positive outcomes from their work. And 6% were acknowledging the messiness of the work. So some things are good and some things are bad, and it's messy. As a critic, I mean, I don't run my own community arts praxis in a hyperlocal context. I take a wider angle lens and I look at lots of people's work in lots of different contexts. I find patterns and I make points of connection. So in what I have made as an artist myself and what I've seen, almost everything is messy and some is good and some is bad. And there are compromises that are made in the real world because we live in the real world and not the ideal world. So that of the published scholarship, only 6% were acknowledging that messiness and 90% were essentially reiterating our own grant speak. That led me to the question, what is going on? Why is it that in this particular pocket of scholarship, we are operating almost exclusively as advocacy or as how-to guide? And while I sort of could posit some assumptions, they're assumptions. They're things I made up. I don't have any actual information to back that up. So I need to learn. And so one of my current projects is I'm expanding some of my earlier work on altruism and on privilege to look at some of the ethics of applied theater criticism and why it is that we have so much trouble critiquing the work. I myself hitting sticky points in my research where, like, I don't want to say that, or that non-professional artist who this is her only platform to speak to the powerful and to be heard. Like, of course, it's not a polished, professional-looking performance. It's not supposed to be. But on what grounds can I critique it? And how do I do that without flattening her into a fictional character, while honoring her own voice, while still contextualizing her within a larger scope social landscape? And as I'm trying to piece this together for myself, recognizing that the power dynamic of a privileged outsider going in and working with less privileged research participants, that's not unique to applied theater. Education does it, sociology and anthropology do it. And so to look at some of those fields and see how they handle it and how that is different from public performances that leads us to treat it differently in theater studies. And in that, also when popular press critics are writing about work that is designed for young communities of color, I live in Chicago, they make a mess. And why is that? What are the obstacles that are blocking ethical criticism of this kind of work? And how do we do it? Because if one of the things I do in my scholarship is call for all the other applied theater scholars to be more critical, right? It's not just advocacy. Well, so maybe I should help provide some tools to help people do that. So that's one set of questions that I'm working with right now. And the other is that as I dig into all of this, part of what it hinges on is the problem that we as a field do not have agreed upon methodologies for how to assess the impact of our work. We use assessment, like that's the tool of the positivist oppressor, or it's annoying paperwork. Either way, like we don't like it. But we need to be able to study our own praxis and say, okay, so what are my real goals? Not what am I telling the funders because that's what they need, because that's in the call for funding. What are my real goals? How will I know when they've been met? What are my participants' goals? How will they know when they've been met? And what are some real methods that we can use to study different kinds of praxis? And I definitely don't have those answers. And initially I sort of thought, well, maybe I'll edit a collection. Maybe I'll ask people. And when I started asking people, I discovered that actually there are no agreed upon methods. And so one of the things that I'd like to be able to do is, if there are PTO members who have field sites in which they've really figured out how to measure their impact and assess their practice, I want to talk to them. I want to hear what they're doing. And those who are trying to figure it out and are kind of flying by the seat of their pants and making it up as they go along and who would like some help, I have some expertise in some research methodologies, and I'd like to be able to come help. I don't know if I'll really help, but to try, and then to be able to write about it so that other people can know what we learn.
That would be getting on the video, but that would be something that we'd love to share with the membership, because there are people on the ground doing the work. And I can tell you, I'm working at a new not-for-profit. They're not new. I'm new to them, and their methods of assessment, fantastic.
Awesome.
They're not doing POTO, but I've been amazed. There are people who figured it out, but it hasn't gotten all the way to what we do yet.
It hasn't made it to the theater end.
No.
And that's the reason to do the study.
It's actually really exciting.
I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, just clear languaging. I mean, that could actually turn into funds.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to, sometimes it's hard to explain to people what it is, but if you can show them results in data and, in that way, then it makes it actually more accessible, I think.
And it doesn't need to be all quantitative data. That when we talk about assessment, we think about, I have to build these bullshit rubrics, and then I have to aggregate numbers and come up with some sort of math. And there are times when that's appropriate language, but often it's the stories that are most effective. But really, what are the stories that show us that an impact is being made? And how can the assessment practices kick up when we have unintended consequences, whether they're negative or positive? How can they show when we're not doing what it is we set out to do? Because often in the service of advocacy, we're designing assessments that reinforce what we already think we're seeing, as opposed to helping us look with clear eyes at what we're really seeing.
Can I go a little bit off topic? Can I go around?
Yeah.
So for people that are new to the work,
Mm-hmm.
actually to anybody that's doing this work, not to be telling stories out of, what we can talk about, but what would you say would be a moment where you clearly were like, one of the questions is, what is effective work? What effective work, or they use that word a lot. What a word is, can you tell me a story or an instance of when the work was not effective? Without naming names.
Yes, when the work got in its own way. So, and I've written about this anecdote, so forgive me those of you who have read it. When I was doing my dissertation project, I was working at an urban school, and I was doing a Theater of the Oppressed residency. And there was this moment in image theater in which the students had made an image that represented gossip. It was a gendered image of gossip. The girls were gossiping. It was about a couple. The boy was walking away from the gossip. In the anti-model, the problem was between the oppressed protagonist, the girl being gossiped about, and the antagonists, the mean girls, right? The boy was there. He was a potential ally, but really he was leaving. So he's a right? He's not really much help. His agenda is to get out of there and to avoid the conflict. The students intervening had this very pervasive set of assumptions about gender roles, that he needed to stand up and be the hero, that was part of what it means to be a man. And trying to intervene, me and the classroom teacher whose classroom I was working in, who works with these kids all the time, who is an experienced and wonderful TO joker, she and I both tried to poke at that. But there's this problem embedded in the assumption that democratic intervention is going to move in progressive directions. And that is that if the work is democratic, the group gets to solve the problems how the group wants to solve the problems. It's theirs. If it's liberating the oppressed, it's moving in progressive directions. Well, what happens when the group's assumptions and desires are not progressive? And so as a critical pedagogue, there's an intervention that we want to make as in the gender norms, right? And as jokers, how do we engage the group where they are with their actual assumptions and desires? And right, their ideal involves the man standing up to be the hero. It's not mine. And so that decision in the moment, like, where do I go? What do I do? Which do I choose? I mean, and then I'm a researcher. So also, like, if I sit back and just watch it, I have more to write about. And so in that tension, right, the work got in its own way.
I live in the South. Yes, I know what you're talking about. So, oh, that's fascinating.
Well, and when Boal was initially designing these theories, when Boal was initially designing this work, he was working in a very different context than I work. And therefore, it's not really reasonable to assume that tools developed for one context are going to translate smoothly into others.
So so for practitioners, then what can they read or practice or like from you and from your experience? Because obviously we're talking to you for a reason. So what do you do when you're in that situation? What do you think?
You do your best. You make a choice. You reflect later. And this is what I mean, the friction where the rubber meets the road. In the moment, you make a choice. That's all you can do.
Yeah. I think a lot of jokers have been there, and it's like, wow. It's especially interesting that both of you that were leading it were both female. So, okay, so we're back to your work in and around, it sounds like in and around education. True or not true?
Well, the last 7, 8 years, I mean, I've been a university professor, and so I'm doing educational theater. I'm doing critical pedagogy in my university theater classroom with my university theater majors at a private liberal arts college in a really terrific theater department. And so, yes, I am an educator. I have not been running a community arts site. I've instead been looking at other people's practice and operating more as a critic and as a scholar.
From the students, okay. So my background, I went to private school K-12, and sometimes I wonder if it isn't quite important to rainbow those very people, to use it as a verb. It's like, if these are the people, they're often drawn to advocacy because they come from a place of privilege, and they see it. They may not understand what it is to be oppressed. A white middle class, white upper class, they may not understand exactly all of the systems at play. But I just wonder, you said 7, 8 years, have you found I don't know if that isn't a wonderful place to begin.
Well, it's a useful place for me to begin because I look like them. And so I'm able to teach a critical awareness of privilege and the ways in which systems benefit them and how non-neutral that is. And I can tell my own story of growing up, upper middle class, white, small town, Connecticut, elite education. And that it took me many years to come to an awareness of my privilege, that we do not spring from our mother's wombs understanding how we fit into the larger social landscape of the world, that takes work and it's hard. But I can make it safe because I have walked that journey, and I can say, okay, we're gonna make a mess. Right? We are a room of white people, we are talking about race, or we are an interracial room that is primarily white and we're talking about race. It's going to be a mess. So if somebody makes a mess, that is, engages in a microaggression, right? Say the language, it's not the right language, help them identify the mess, help them clean it up. It doesn't mean that they're a terrible person. It doesn't mean, right? Because often the thing that paralyzes the privilege is guilt. And the sense that this is not my story, I therefore have no right to intervene with it. And yeah, sometimes privilege and that awareness means shutting up and listening. Like I said before, asking real questions and listening to the answer. But it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be asking the questions. And so I embed that sensibility and that engagement with critical citizenship through all of my core theater classes. I don't teach a separate theater and social change class because that would attract the 6 kids who really want to have that conversation at any given point in time. And there are lots of ways I can help those 6 kids get a deeper dive into this work. The students who need it are the ones who would not think to seek it out. And so I bring it to them.
So for those students, now I love that we're like way off this list because of course I had questions after reading your bio and learning about you. So let's say you're a new person, right? You stumbled upon our Facebook page. You don't know what's really going on. Maybe you played like a game at some point in your life and you're starting to think things, you know how it starts in your mind. You're like, oh, wow. Oh. So for those students who want to start thinking about it, what would you recommend they do first, or read or look at, or what would you recommend?
I would start with bell hooks, Teaching to Transgress. I think that bell hooks synthesizes Freire in very accessible language. And Freire's language is complicated and initially off-putting for a lot of people. And so to start with hooks to get to that basic philosophy, I think that's the best place to begin. From there, I'd go to Freire and really read the heavy theory and dig into the heavy theory. And I would find people in your community who are doing work that helps communities solve their own problems.
Do you feel like let's say it's you. So as a white upper middle class female, educated female, do you think it's important to start with people who look like you to do this work, or can you go somewhere different? Like, could you work on issues of race instead of just gender?
Yeah, well, I do work on issues of race. And I think that there is so much to be learned from being uncomfortable, from going to places that are not yours and learning to ask questions and listen to the answers and know that it is not yours, that you're there to help, and that helping sometimes will mean getting out of the way. Honestly, I started this work as a teaching artist. I was working in urban schools. I was doing that because that's what people paid me to do. And I was in my 20s and I needed to pay my rent. And so I stumbled upon this work out of the material conditions of my real life. I didn't start working in an affluent suburban district or in a ritzy private school. I started in urban charter schools, being terrible at it. From being terrible at it, I went to graduate school and I got formal training. That's not a luxury everyone can engage in. That's privilege that I could say, okay, I'm going to stop what I'm doing for a year. I'm going to go to NYU. That's non-neutral. That's not the only way to learn about this work. But I think the core of the work is service-oriented and facilitation-oriented. And so it's not going in and saying, I have theater, who has a problem? It's working with organizations that are deeply embedded in the community that are helping to try to solve problems. And the solutions may or may not require theater. But to understand that ethos, because the question is then, well, how can my theater skills help? And I don't do a lot of TO these days because I'm not a community organizer. Forum doesn't help with most of the problems that I'm encountering in my day-to-day praxis. So I don't use it. It's more effective to say, okay, so what are the problems? What does this group actually need? Do they need me to facilitate a consensus building process? Okay, well then that's what I'll do. I said earlier, I have expertise in research methodologies. Maybe that's the more useful skill set that I can bring. Sometimes I can sew. And the thing that's helpful is that I can teach sewing. Okay. And really, it's community specific, and going in without the assumption that I know what tools they will need enables me to help find the tools that are most useful. And as I say and as I write, those might not always be theater.
That's powerful. It also gets to the core of it, what we're here to do, those of us who think that way on this planet. Okay, so do you have anything? Okay, so you've got this research project and they can contact you with your work email. Is that how you would like people, once they see the video, they know what you're looking to collaborate on?
Yes. Dani.Snyder.young@gmail.com is probably the best way to reach me. That'll sort of I tend to keep my research files in my personal email as opposed to in my work email. So that's probably the best.
And if they're watching this video in the future, it is now 2015. We're moving into 2016.
Mm-hmm.
This project, you're looking for participants or collaborative moments through
people who have answers to the question, have their own answers to the question. It's hard to say. My guess is probably the next 3 years I'll be doing the sort of data collection intervention stage, but it's a little hard to know.
And you're looking for anyone from like on the ground community organizers all the way to other academic types, researchers?
I think I'm looking for on the ground community organizers, but everyone from like little micro project to, education director at an institutional regional theater.
And you're looking for international or national?
US-based. I'm looking for US based. There are plenty of folk, not plenty, but there are folk in Australia and in Ireland and in the UK and in Canada who are doing this kind of work, but they're working in very different funding structures than we do in the United States. And so actually, I'm looking for US-based case studies because the way we have to do it, the material conditions are so different than they are in Australia when there's ample government funding.
I got it. Oh, I'm already thinking of people I want to send this information to.
Yeah, please do send people to me. I would love to come and help or try to help and learn or learn about what people are doing that works.
Ooh. And what I heard was the assessment piece. I found that I'm really interested in watching and reading and being in the conversation with what you find. I think that is extremely important. And actually, as a former theater professor, it could have helped me talk about the work we were doing or frame it up, or like, it's just like, I think it's extremely valuable. So I'm wishing you the best of luck.
Well, thank you. And I expect that reporting out about this work is not something that I'm going to do solo, because it's participatory action research. It's then collaborative. It's collaborative research. It's potentially collaborative presentations and publications. And I mean, I'm not taking credit for the work everybody else is doing. I'm maybe just helping to collect it in one place.
Wonderful. Is there anything, okay, 2 more questions, and then I know we'll move on to the rest of your day, Professor. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us? It could be anything, thoughts, comments, encouragement, questions, and then also, what have you valued most out of the membership that you've had with PTO as an organization?
So I don't off the top of my head have any new questions or pieces of wisdom to disperse that come from a place other than this conversation. But I went to my first PTO in North Carolina as a graduate student, and I met Kelly Howe at breakfast, and we sat and talked for like an hour. And I thought, wow, I have met a really smart person who I hope I get to keep talking to about these big questions for the rest of my life. And here we are 10 years later. To me, PTO is initially the place where I started to learn about the practice, how to do the work, how people were doing the work. At mid-career, it's a place I come to reconnect with people who are working on the ground, and to old friends who are asking big, messy questions who I don't otherwise have the excuse to interact with, because we're all locked in our own lives and our own field sites.
Totally agree with you. Absolutely. And this gave me the opportunity to meet you. I'm so fortunate.
No, it's very nice to meet you too. And I love how PTO goes out of its way to be accessible to students, to community workers, and that it's not a space by and for academics. It's about the practitioners. In a lot of ways, as a scholar, I'm a bit of an outlier at PTO, and I I very much appreciate that space.
We appreciate the work that you're doing to help frame up what are we doing, right? The assessment piece of it. So I think it's all extremely valuable. And thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for talking to me. This was great fun.
Yes, thank you so much.